All right, so this video is continuing my sort of recap for the introduction of Sara Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology. This is for the section starting points, pages 5 through 12. I'm just sort of picking out things, that are the key points. So this is the sort of quick and dirty video version of the introduction. So, starting out with chapter 5, Ahmed writes, in order to become orientated, you might suppose that we must first experience disorientation. And this is, both these concepts are key for her orientation and disorientation. And she actually asks at the end of the chapter, where is it? What would a politics of disorientation look like? Starting here, Ahmed uses the philosopher Immanuel Kant's "What does it mean to orient oneself in thought?" Kant uses a kind of philosophical thought experiment in which someone is blindfolded in an unfamiliar room. So how do you find your way out? And Kant's argument about this is that it requires distinguishing between the sides of your body, right side, left side, and thus, in an atmosphere where you don't have access to sight and you don't have access to memory, like of the layout of a space, you can rely on this internal spatial distinction and sort of apply it to your landscape. So then at this point, Ahmed takes us a couple hundred years in the future from Kant to Martin Heidegger, and observing that for Heidegger, orientation is not about differentiating between the sides of the body, which allow us to know which way to turn, but about the familiarity of the world. So this is, which way to turn versus how do we come to feel at home. I literally wrote in my notes interjection here and then didn't say what I was going to be interjecting about. Okay, so moving on to page 7, Ahmed has kind of set the scene here. And once she's done this, she walks us through her own interpretation of this experiment and thinks through the stakes of orientation and intimacy when it comes to finding one's way. So again, waffling between the concepts of orientation and disorientation, she writes, getting lost still takes us somewhere. Being lost can, in its turn, become a familiar feeling. And then also, the work of inhabiting space involves a dynamic negotiation between what is familiar and unfamiliar, such that it is still possible for the world to create new impressions, depending on which way we turn, which affects what is within reach. So this is huge for Ahmed, that the idea that that navigating a space involves negotiating the familiar and the unfamiliar, but that also, depending on which way we turn, and often our turns are plotted out for us, this affects what we're even able to perceive. And this is how she, this is one of the ways in which she queers phenomenology by suggesting that diverging from the lines that are plotted out for us enables us to turn towards queer objects that might otherwise be hidden or occluded by a normative path. Okay, so next on page 8, Ahmed turns to Husserl. I fully admit that I have never known how to say this phenomenologist's name. Husserl? Husserl? I'm really hoping that someone will clue me in the course of this class. Okay, so yeah, but in volume 2 of his book, Ideas, Ahmed talks about Husserl's concept of orientations are about how we begin, how we proceed from here, which affects how what is there appears, how it presents itself. And also the starting point for orientation is the point from which the world unfolds, the here of the body and the where of its dwelling. So this complicates the idea of here and there as not, two places, but that there's this primary here, which is the body, and that's always the starting point from any sort of orienting process. And then also, proceeding along the line of like classical phenomenologists, from pages 8 to 9, Ahmed moves to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, author of The Phenomenology of Perception. And let's see, she writes, in turn, given the history of such responses, which accumulate as impressions on the skin, bodies do not dwell in spaces that are exterior, but rather are shaped by their dwellings and take shape by dwelling. And there's an example here that suggests itself of like the goosebumps caused by wind where it brushes the skin. And this idea of bodies not dwelling in spaces that are exterior, but being shaped by their dwellings and taking shape by dwelling also brings me back to why I was drawn to Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space, which some of you might have participated in that reading group, but Bachelard in that book talks about the space of the home, like domestic spaces, familiar spaces, from the perspective of literature, but also from the perspective a little bit of like the child, and thinking not just about the actual structure of the house, but the sort of psychological structure that the house creates and supports, and the idea of it as nest, as shell, as these sort of like archetypal organic forms. Anyway, yeah. So next on page 9, Ahmed reflects on her previous book, Strange Encounters, Embodied Others in Post-Coloniality, which she wrote, I think, or published anyway, 6 years before. And she brings this one up because she's talking about the process of like finding our way and homing devices, like the navigational devices of birds, migrating birds, and analogizing that to migrating humans. She talks about how migration involves re-inhabiting the skin, the different impressions of a new landscape, the air, the smells, the sound, which accumulate like points to create lines, or which accumulate like lines to create new textures on the surface of the skin. So this is another way of saying, or multiple ways of thinking about lines. The lines of migration, moving from one place to another place, moving from one culture to another culture, and then the way that this trajectory is seen on the skin itself. And this is a little bit, I don't know if people are going to find this too poetic, but it makes a lot of sense to me. I wrote a little note here to talk about, one of the things Ahmed does, justifies in the course of this chapter is mixing in personal reflections. And because she chooses to do it, I feel authorized to do that myself. So I wrote a little note to myself to talk here about the various sort of like geographic migrations of my own life. My family moved a lot between the big cities of Texas, and then, in my mid-20s, I left Texas for California, and then about a decade later, I left California for Massachusetts, which, is, I think, reflected on my skin and in my body, even though that's migration. within one nation state, it's nonetheless migration between different cultures and climates and forms of social life. So I feel like even if in kind of an oblique way, I have, you know, I draw on that to understand what Ahmed talks about when she talks about migration. Um, and then also, she has this contention that one need not leave home for things to be disoriented or reoriented. Homes, too, can be giddy places where things are not always held in place, and homes can move as we do. And then, given that she has already indicated that the body itself is a home or starting point, I interpret this sentence in light of my own changing body as I age, um, my body as I move in and out of illness, um, and then especially as I have morphed it with hormones. Um, I think about that sort of temporal trajectory of the body through the trajectories of my body. So then, straddling pages 9 and 10, Sara Ahmed talks about Avtar Bra and the idea of diasporic spaces. Quote, diasporic spaces do not simply begin to take shape with the arrival of migrant bodies. It is more that we only notice the arrival of those who appear out of place. Those who are in place must also arrive, but their arrival is more easily forgotten or not even noticed. And then this is her way into talking about her own experience as a migrant subject. What I remember are not so much the giddy experiences of moving and the disorientation of being out of place, but the ways we have of settling, that is, of inhabiting spaces that, in the first instance, are unfamiliar, but that we can imagine, sometimes with fear, other times with desire, might come to feel like home. So this speaks to the sort of possibility of a politics of disorientation, or not even, put that another way, the disorientation that is this sort of primary experience that then later I would say, like secondarily makes, opens up the possibility of a politics. And the way in which that initial disorientation is registered in a bodily way and registered affectually, emotionally through fear or desire. And then she talks some more here about packing, moving, the idea of the house's shell, which again takes me back to Bachelard, and uses the example of, I wrote down flinging the cumin. So I'm going to go to page 10 and figure out what the heck flinging the cumin was. Oh, here we go. Yeah. I concentrate on the kitchen. The familiar smell of spices fills the air. I allow the cumin to spill and then gather it up again. I feel flung back somewhere else. I am never sure where the smell of spices takes me, as it has followed me everywhere. Flinging the, we're going to use flinging the cumin as shorthand for that. So, she spatializes this process as her trajectory of the rooms that she sets up when she moves. So the first one is the kitchen, where the flinging happens. And then the next one is about the study. So she brings in the traditional person to bring in here, if you are a woman who writes, you might mention, as Ahmed does, Virginia Woolf, and the room and writing table, the space that is required to write. And knowing Ahmed, we can imagine this as, actually spatial, like it embodies space, a room, a desk, but also the way that carving out that space also signals the desire to, or the intention to carve out a social space. Um, Loving one's home is not about being fixed into a place, but rather it is about becoming part of a space where one has expanded one's body, saturating the space with bodily matter. Home is overflowing and flowing over. This is what Ahmed writes, but she also affirms that you might be homesick or experience the feeling of being joyously not at home. And then she also points ahead to chapter 2, acknowledging that the family home is invested in things like heterosexual intimacy. So going home as a queer person is disorienting. And this is how she describes it. In such moments when bodies do not extend into space, they might feel out of place where they have been given a place. Such feelings in turn point to other places, even ones that have yet to be inhabited. My own story of orientation is just such a queer point. And then this is where I sort of want to interject as I'm reading my belief or my conjecture that to be queer and potentially also to be diasporic is to have an edge. Maybe one edge of a double-edged sword, the other side of which is perhaps directed towards one's own body, but still to have an edge because one has more disorientation to think through. So the next section of the introduction to queer phenomenology is called Lines That Direct Us. And this is significant to take notice of because Ahmed uses a lot of wordplay in this section. She already has, but she really ramps it up, availing herself of the fact that many words have multiple definitions. She also delves into etymology. She uses idioms. The words she thinks a lot about the words that we turn to, and what it means to turn to various terms. Page 12, she brings in another person from the canon of spatial thinkers, Henri Lefebvre, who wrote a book called The Production of Space. And she uses his work to think about how if space is orientated, then what appears depends on one's point of view. And if we think of space as orientation, as I will suggest, then our work will in turn acquire a new direction, which opens up how spatial perceptions come to matter and be directed as matter. So this is part of that wordplay. This is two kinds of mattering, like matter in the sense of accruing substance, becoming substantial, matter as stuff as opposed to energy, and then mattering as a verb, like this matters to me, this is important. So Ahmed talks about absolute versus relative here, and then the sort of geographical concepts of location versus position. And to do this, she uses Neil Smith and Cindy Katz's work. Location, she distinguishes, fixes a point in space, whereas position, by contrast, implies location vis-a-vis other locations. So this is basically just a conceptual, slightly more abstract way of saying left is different than east. Left and right involve distinctions within the body. East has to be east of something. And this is the question of position. And then Ahmed talks about how the social depends in part on agreement about how we measure space and time. So this is a nod here to the fact that we're thinking about all this stuff through, um, the Enlightenment project and the colonial project, which is all about measuring, standardizing, dividing. Um, yeah, the social depends in part on agreement about how we measure space and time, which is why social conflict can often be experienced as being out of time as well as out of place with others. Um, and then direction only makes sense as a relationship between body and space. So from that first thought experiment that we saw in Kant, that involves the blindfolded person in an unfamiliar room, thrown back on their inner distinction between right and left, we've come to this point where Ahmed is asserting that directionality isn't just a distinction within the body, it's a function of the interaction between the body and the space that it's in. And then, returning to Kant, returning to the left-right distinction, Ahmed notes, following Robert Hertz, that, and also Kant, that the left-right distinction itself isn't neutral. Quote, this lack of neutrality is what grounds the distinction between right and left. The right becomes the straight line, and the left becomes the origin of deviation. And then by extension, the east, as well as the left, is thus orientated. It acquires its direction only by taking a certain point of view as given. So this is Ahmed taking note of a spatialized version of a dichotomy that runs through culture of right and left, self and other, east and west, and then this section, so following the title of the section at large, lines that direct us, Ahmed really drills down into lines at this point. She, in a way that is like making me spin out and think about lines. One of the things that I used, I think I put a bad photograph I took of one of Renee Gladman's prose architecture drawings in the syllabus. And I love the idea of like a prose architecture. And even without having any other knowledge of that, just to describe it, it's a kind of writing as drawing or asemic writing, like a writing that doesn't correspond to conventional signs, like a drawing that's writing or a writing that's drawing, I guess, but that somehow suggests a narrative or moves us through space and moves us through thought in a certain way. I was also thinking here of old Hollywood movies when they move from location to location, the ones that used a map with a dotted line showing where the boat or the plane or the train is traveling. And then I also thought about Harold and the Purple Crayon, and I don't know, I was spinning out Donnie Darko, desire lines, like thinking about lines of direction and lines of intention. So in 14, Ahmed talks about Judith Butler, William James, and again Henri Lefebvre. If space is always orientated, as Lefebvre argues, then inhabiting spaces decides what comes into view. We take what is given as simply a matter of what happens to be in front of us. And so what this really means is that phenomenology is, for Ahmed, in part a matter of learning to perceive otherwise than we have been habituated to. And so following a line for Ahmed means having a field of unreachable objects. We do not have to consciously exclude those things that are not online, The direction we take excludes things for us before we even get there. So this is a really crucial part of Ahmed's argumentation. This idea that we're on a course. We're headed to a place, and that place might be more of a life destination. Like, if we imagine, for instance, compulsory heterosexuality as a line, it directs us towards certain objects of desire, and prevents us from seeing other bodies, other people, other ways of relating as desirable. We're not necessarily even trying to exclude that, but just by the fact of pointing ourselves in that direction, they are already excluded for us. A key argument in this book is that the body gets directed in some ways more than others. But if direction, as the way we face as well as move, is organized rather than casual, we might speak then of collective direction. So this is really interesting. I'm interested to see where this happens, where this argument takes us, and how collective direction is related to Ahmed's stated interest in using the methodologies of Marxism, which is obviously concerned about the collective in the form of labor and workers, and feminism, which is also in some ways considering a class, a collectivity. So yeah, we follow the line that is followed by others. The repetition of the act of following makes the line disappear from view as the point from which we emerge. So that's a line to follow in our pursuit of understanding Ahmed's text, following the we. And where is a we that has been invisibilized, made visible by how we disorient ourselves. So on page 15, following Judith Butler and Althusser, Ahmed talks about how another aspect of orientation is the way in which we turn when we're hailed. And the famous Althusserian example of this is the way that we're compelled to turn. Like if a police officer is like, stop, we understood ourselves as being spoken to, and beyond understanding ourselves as being spoken to, we understand ourselves also as answerable to that command. So one way that I was interpreting this personally is the way in which, like, I'm an extremely out trans person, but so this is not terrible to talk about. When I hear people calling for someone, like calling the name that I was assigned at birth, sometimes I'll have to resist the urge to turn around. Which for me is a good illustration of the way that repetition, and I think this is why Ahmed is bringing in Butler here, like iterativity, repetition. Butler has this idea of performativity, which isn't about performance, but is more about repetition. So for instance, in the example of the name, when I hear people call this name, that's a name that I was called and answered to for, 25 years, 24, 25 years, and a little longer for some people. And that shaped me. That shaped the selectivity of my hearing. It's a name that I listen for. It's a name that I learn to associate with myself. It's a name that gives people a kind of power. And there are implications for turning when you're called something, and not turning Okay, does that make sense? If such turns are repeated over time, then bodies acquire the very shape of such direction. So, yeah, I mean, I just understand that as turning to answer to that name gave me a certain shape, and ceasing to turn to answer that name allowed me to take another shape. On 16, there's a very etymologically focused section. Ahmed talks about the etymology of direction. To go directly is to follow a line without a detour, without mediation. Within the concept of direction is a concept of straightness. To follow a line might be a way of becoming straight by not deviating at any point. So again, there's this what I think of as extremely generative blurring of like the spatial and the social. Um, when we what happens if someone says to us, head straight home, don't deviate. There's a straightness of being on course, and then there's also a kind of spatialized straightness. 16, again, it's about paths. Lines are both created by being followed and are followed by being created as an effect of work, which is often hidden from view. So again, something is hidden, something's occluded, which is the poety version of hidden that I like. So in following the directions, I arrive as if by magic. And there are multiple things that Ahmed seems to think of as hidden. For one, in terms of orientation in a certain direction towards a certain object or set of objects, hides from view other objects and other potential directions we might take. And also they hide work, they hide labor. Directions are about the magic of arrival, Ahmed writes. The work of arrival is forgotten in the very feeling that arrival is magic. So this to me really, I mean, I'm not a huge reader of Marxist work, but this makes me think of its affinities for Marx, and the idea of revealing relationships or revealing labor that has been actively and purposefully, in many cases, hidden. And then this section also has me thinking personally about the work of staying on a path. I talked about transitioning and as one sort of deviation or like change of course. And then also one thing that's very in mind for me reading this is that I've had a very deviant relationship to normative academic life. I dropped out of most things that it's possible to drop out from. Latest being PhD school. And this has me thinking about what are the paths where it would require more labor, more work that's less endurable or even unendurable to remain on a given line than it would be to diverge from it. It is not automatic that we reproduce what we inherit, or that we always convert our inheritance into possessions. We must pay attention to the pressure to make such conversions. When we are pressed into lines, just as lines are the accumulation of such moments of pressure, or what I call stress points in chapter 3. Pressure, force. We don't know what it means to follow the gift of the unexpected line that gives us the chance for a new direction and even a chance to live again. So there's the pressure to follow a certain course, and then there's also the possibility of chance interactions or chance events to give us a kind of lifeline. And the way that I was interpreting this was I was thinking about, I love the Wizard of Oz books. Um, and at least two, and I'm sure more of the books, Oz as a sort of utopian space um, is arrived at through these cataclysmic weather events. In one of the books, it's tornado, and another one it's an ocean squall. Um, yeah, it's these moments of disorientation that lead to um, a lifeline. So 18 again, the concept of wrinkles comes up. Lines become the external trace of an interior world, as signs of who we are on the flesh that folds and unfolds before others. Um, I think that's beautiful. Um, for it is important to remember that life is not always linear, or that the lines we follow do not always lead us to the same place. This section on 18 has me thinking about the idea of the sunk cost fallacy, um, or this idea that because we've given a certain amount of time and effort to continuing along a certain line, um, we have to be sort of stuck in that, because then diverging might mean that we had squandered the energy or resources or labor that we had put into it. It's interesting here for me stylistically that Ahmed lapses into the second person. She talks about a you, and then builds a kind of abstracted narrative as she talks about the nonlinearity of life, and the fact that our investments in specific routes can be hidden from view, as they are the point from which we view the world that surrounds us. Again, yeah, she talks some more about accidental and chance encounters that help us go off course. She refers to these as sideways moments that might become a lifeline, or be seen as a lifeline in retrospect through hindsight. And this is making me think a lot of two of my favorite other thinkers. I can call it a poet a thinker. Emily Dickinson, and the idea of the slant. And then Svetlana Boym, who I love so much, and who I think probably her Future of Nostalgia is going to be my next reading group. But she talks about the off modern, and the Shklovskian night move. The night move in chess is, two steps forward, one step over, so that in the end what's achieved is a kind of diagonal, but it's a kind of zigzagging. So in 19, Ahmed's personal investment shows up here through discussion of sexuality. She writes, I think one of the reasons that I became interested in the very question of direction was because in the middle of my life I experienced a dramatic redirection. I left the world of heterosexuality and became a lesbian, even though this means staying in a heterosexual world. And then, desire lines show up again here. Becoming a lesbian taught me about the very point of how life gets directed, and how that point is often hidden from view. Becoming reorientated, which involves the disorientation of encountering the world differently, made me wonder about orientation and how much feeling at home or knowing which way we are facing is about the making of worlds. And I love this. I love that Ahmed talks about world, I mean, not in the literal sense of like the globe, but also world as the horizon of what's possible, like the life world, the lived experience, or the possibility for differing ranges of lived experience that are sometimes metonymized as simply sexualities. So we talk about losing our way as well as finding our way, the temporality of orientations are effects of what we tend toward, where the toward marks a space and time that is almost but not quite available in the present. And then on 20, also Ahmed is asking, what is your dwelling? What is your place of residence? We might note here that the dwelling refers to the process of coming to reside, or what Heidegger calls making room. So how do we make our worlds? How do we make room for ourselves? What kind of dwellings do we find ourselves in, and what is possible as a function of dwelling thusly, or dwelling there? The hope of changing directions is that we don't always know where some paths may take us. Risking departure from the straight and narrow makes new futures possible, which might involve going astray, getting lost, or even becoming queer. So again, there's this real intersection between several different ways of conceptualizing reality, or ways that we conceptualize different strands of reality, the spatial, the social, the sexual, and what does it mean to think sexual queerness alongside the sort of ontological disorientation that comes from migration. I think this is one of the most exciting things that Ahmed does for me, which is like bringing those two things together. So again, sexual orientation. The concept of orientations allows us to expose how life gets directed in some ways rather than others, through the very requirement that we follow what is already given to us. For a life to count as a good life, then it must return the debt of its life by taking on the direction promised as a social good, which means imagining one's futurity in terms of reaching certain points along a life course. A queer life might be one that fails to make such gestures of return. I can't help but think of this section parentally or familially in the context of compulsory heterosexuality, and the idea that for the gift of your own life, you are owed a return in the form of living your life in a certain way, having children, living a life that has certain points that you have to hit. So what does it mean to become this queer who fails to make gestures of return? So starting on 21 through, I guess, 24, Ahmed, she doesn't mark it as a separate section, but it feels like a separate section, which would probably just be called conclusion. This is where she does the academic thing of like, okay, in what follows, you will meet with 3 chapters. 1, a reflection on the concepts within phenomenology. So, right, what is phenomenology? What can we do with it? 2, a turning to the question of sexual orientation through whatever's opened up through the focus on phenomenology in chapter 1. And then 3, the orientation of Orientalism as a point of entry for reconsidering how racism orientates the body in certain ways. On 22, Ahmed talks about how her writing moves between conceptual analysis and personal digression, but then she questions her impulse to refer to her use of the personal as a digression. And this is interesting to me because this book came out in 2006, and I would say that, at least in the corners that I lurk in, it's this situation that Ahmed was writing into has in some ways flip-flopped, in which case it's in some places, in some corners of academia or intellectual inquiry outside of academia, such as it is, um, it's now more compulsory, to include the personal. And I think that in the same way that Ahmed, is performing a kind of queer gesture by including the personal, I think I've noticed that for some people, contemporarily, even though this is just like 15 years later, um, some people now think of the queering gesture as, resisting the compulsion to include the personal, or you know finding ways to disorient, the personal's presence, within this kind of writing. Anyway, this is just my aside. Um, so, um, Oh yeah. So after this, Ahmed talks about one of the starting points, or how one of the starting points for her was her captivation, with Husserl's use of the table, um, as sort of this object to think through. She writes, "I found myself seated at my table, at the different tables that mattered at different points in my life. How I wanted to make these tables matter." Um, Ahmed notes the irony that it was Husserl's table that led her to the queer potential of this gathering. This is really, I mean, this is something that we can all do together, but this is there. This is a great point. There are other great points, within this book to pause and reflect on, the tables in our lives, the tables that have mattered, and how, and to further reflect how, we can articulate the ways that they mattered, or the social arrangements that they point to that matter to us, in a way that might matter to other people. On 22, there's a preference for queer turnings due to lack of a disciplinary line. So Ahmed talks about how, you know, maybe she is the way that she is, theoretically, due to being between disciplines, and hence disruptive of a normative genealogical lineage, in the sense that, she was taught by so-and-so, who was taught by so-and-so, and this line, this genealogical line, is traceable back, and also that it's traceable back within the proper channels, like a historian who teaches a historian who teaches a historian, and this is also something that is very resonant to me, because my entry point, into the poetry world as like a teenager, an early 20 something, as I was learning to navigate that, and to make the mental map, and to register the values and concerns of that world. The context that I was in, was very much operating, with a sort of genealogical understanding itself. There was this idea that, not only that your teacher was taught by so and so, who was taught by so and so, but also that, your teacher is of a certain, formal conceptual lineage, or a school, and that you are also, need to sort of like show your adherence to that school. And none of this was like explicitly, or I mean, mostly wasn't explicitly vocalized to me, but it's something that I've had to do a lot of thinking through, and unlearning in retrospect. Partially because I didn't easily or organically, fit in in the lineage where I was expected to fit. Um, and this produced, first, I think, a sense of discomfort and failure for me. But then subsequently, it opened up a space to question the naturalness of that. Anyway, so from this, Ahmed talks about the risks of working outside one's discipline. She starts a little bit cheekily, in favor of this practice of going between disciplines. But then she acknowledges, I think, in this paragraph, some of the risks, which include removing work from its original context, the context that explains and undergirds it, and that this is a risk of interdisciplinary work and multidisciplinary work. As really just as a way to say, taking care involves work, and it is work that we must do if we are to create something other than another point on a line. So this is Ahmed affirming that though her orientation is towards the interdisciplinary and the multidisciplinary, it's a rebellion from strict disciplinarity and not a rebellion from care and close attention. And I wonder also if there's a bit of preemptive defensiveness here about potential critiques that might come from the academy with respect to rigor. That would never have occurred to me, but the presence of this moment in the introduction makes me wonder if they did occur to Ahmed. So finally, on page 23, chapter 1, in chapter 1, Ahmed is going to work closely with phenomenological texts in order to develop an approach to the concept of orientations. She stresses that she's going to be using Marxism and feminist theory with an awareness of how forms of labor are relegated to the background, how spatial orientations are shaped by other social orientations such as gender and class as an effect of repeated actions over time. Chapter 2, Ahmed's going to ask, what does it mean to queer phenomenology? First by locating queer moments within the canonical. And the canonical here is embodied by Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. Ahmed intends to think slantwise and to show how compulsory heterosexuality operates as a straightening device, which rereads signs of queer desire as deviation from the straight line. And she introduces the figure of the contingent lesbian, which I don't remember what that is at this moment, but it sounds exciting. Chapter 3, Ahmed considers the significance of the orient and orientation, that orientations involve the racialization of space, and that we become racialized in how we occupy space, just as space is, as it were, already occupied as an effect of racialization. And then part of this, for Ahmed, involves drawing on her own experiences of being at home within her mixed race heritage. And then finally, Ahmed writes, queer objects might take us to the very limits of social gathering. Indeed, to live out a politics of disorientation might be to sustain wonder about the very forms of social gathering. So again, this has me asking, like, what would a politics of disorientation look like in practice? Would it involve different people at the table? Would it involve a different kind of table? Or would it involve throwing the table away altogether, which is to say, rejecting any sort of received forms of social organization in favor of something radically different? Um, so this has been kind of the quick and dirty recap of the introduction, and I look forward to seeing you all in the discussion and writing section. Thank